Autumn 1944. The Hürtgen Forest on the German-Belgian frontier. A German reconnaissance patrol crawls forward through the spruce trees in the pre-dawn cold. Their orders are unambiguous. There is an American position one ridge over. It has gone quiet for 36 hours. Find out who holds it, how many, and what they intend to do next. This is what scouts do. Across 2,000 years of recorded military history, this is what scouts have always done. Get close, watch, listen, count. German reconnaissance patrols on the Western Front had been trained to do something more specific still: read the small signs the enemy left behind. A ration can stamped with a division supply code told you which formation had passed through. A bandage wrapper with a manufacturer's date told you when. A distinctive vehicle track told you how they had arrived. A half-burned letter told you when the unit had last been paid, and from what town its men had been riding home. German intelligence doctrine had a name for the discipline of gathering this material: Spurensichern, securing the traces. From these traces, the IC officer, the German Army's designation for its intelligence staff position at division level, built his picture of the enemy on the map. The patrol reached the American position that night. It had been held for several days. The Americans were gone. The ground was not merely quiet, it was empty in a way the scouts had never specifically been trained to interpret. The foxholes had been filled and tamped down. The slit trenches were collapsed and covered. Whatever ration containers had once been there were gone, buried or burned somewhere the patrol could not locate. No scraps of paper, no cigarette butts. The latrines had been filled and disguised under branches and leaves. No shoulder patches, no letters, no trash, because there was no trash to find. The patrol returned to its own lines and made its report. The IC officer reading it would have asked the only reasonable question a competent intelligence officer can ask when his scouts come back with nothing. Are you certain they were actually there? Yes. There were depressions in the leaf litter where men had slept, faint tire tracks on the approach road. Americans had unmistakably occupied this ground. Which division, though? Which regiment? In what strength, for how long, and moving in what direction? The scouts could not say. The ground itself would not say. Across the Western Front in 1944 and into 1945, this kind of report reached German intelligence officers again and again. The specific word that recurs across post-war interrogations of these same officers, describing their reaction, is not the German word for anger, and not the word for simple frustration. It is Rätselhaft, baffling, in the sense of a puzzle that offers no visible pieces to work with at all. Within weeks, this same accumulated blankness on the map would feed directly into one of the largest single intelligence failures of the entire war. The manual behind this discipline sat almost entirely outside popular memory of the war. 38 plain pages, drafted 21 months before Pearl Harbor, in a small office inside the United States War Department. Its consequences, compounded quietly across 4 years and 2 theaters, would eventually help decide how badly a German general staff misjudged an American army it could no longer reliably see. To understand why an empty foxhole could break a German IC officer's picture of the battlefield, it helps first to understand exactly what that officer had spent his career being trained to do. German ground reconnaissance doctrine descended through the Prussian general staff tradition, running back conceptually to the Napoleonic Wars, and rested on 3 converging sources of information: aerial reconnaissance flown by the Luftwaffe, radio interception carried out by dedicated Army signals units, and ground reconnaissance conducted by scouts on foot. A division commander seated before his map with his IC officer beside him assembled his picture of the enemy from these 3 streams. Of the 3, the men walking the ground were considered the most intimate source, because only a scout could enter a position the enemy had just abandoned and read it the way a trained investigator reads a scene. This 3-pillar structure had been formalized well before the war, refined through decades of institutional practice and staff college instruction that treated ground reconnaissance as a genuine professional discipline rather than a simple auxiliary function. Officer candidates destined for intelligence postings studied specific historical case examples in which ground signs alone had correctly identified an enemy formation days before any other source confirmed it. The discipline carried real institutional prestige inside the German officer corps, and the men assigned to it generally regarded themselves, with some justification, as practitioners of a genuine craft rather than mere information gatherers. German doctrine sorted the signs scouts hunted for into roughly 4 categories. Identification: anything naming the specific enemy unit, a discarded shoulder patch, a letter fragment carrying a return address, a ration tin stamped with a depot code. Strength: anything suggesting numbers, the size of a latrine trench, the density of depressions where men had slept in the open. Intent: anything suggesting direction of movement, which way vehicle tracks pointed, whether a position looked hastily abandoned or methodically vacated. Condition: anything suggesting morale, the tone of an unburned letter, fingernail gouges left in a trench wall during a period of sustained shelling. This tradecraft was old, and on the Eastern Front it had worked with real consistency. Soviet positions, when overrun or abandoned, tended to yield abundant material: cigarette papers, copies of Pravda, Cyrillic-stamped ration cans, family photographs, identity documents. German scouts operating against the Red Army rarely returned from a captured position entirely empty-handed, and the volume of material available was often great enough that the specific challenge facing German intelligence lay less in finding evidence than in processing and correctly interpreting the quantity of it that came back through the lines. Then the German army began encountering the Americans, first in Tunisia across 1942 and 1943, then in Sicily and Italy, then in Normandy, through the long retreat across France, and finally at the West Wall and in the forests along the German frontier. By the autumn of 1944, German intelligence officers had been running into American formations for close to 2 years, and the same specific observation kept recurring in their after-action reports. The Americans were different. Positions they had occupied, once captured or abandoned, yielded substantially less identifying material than equivalent positions left by any other force in the war. Italian positions had left mountains of paperwork behind. British positions left a fair quantity. French positions left less still. American positions left almost nothing at all. German officers reaching for an explanation initially settled on the 2 most obvious candidates. Perhaps this reflected sheer material abundance, an army so well supplied that individual soldiers simply felt no attachment to personal effects worth preserving. Or perhaps it reflected an unusual national fastidiousness, a society that placed unusually high value on cleanliness even under combat conditions. What did not occur to them, for a specific and traceable reason, was that an entire army had been deliberately and systematically drilled, years before any of its soldiers had ever crossed an ocean, in the precise tradecraft of denying a German intelligence officer exactly the material he needed. That reason is worth holding on to, because the consequences compounded for the rest of the war. Every division commander forced to guess at American positions from insufficient ground reporting was making that guess inside a chain of decisions that, compounded across Italy, France, and Belgium, would eventually matter at a scale far beyond any single reconnaissance patrol. Of every category of sign German scouts had been trained to identify, the one category their doctrine had never developed a method for interpreting was absence itself. Spulensichern assumed traces existed and needed only to be located and read correctly. When traces simply did not exist, the doctrine had nothing further to offer. And the American soldier actually filling in his own foxhole that autumn would, if asked, have had no idea he was executing a counterintelligence operation at all. He would have said he was policing his area because his sergeant had told him to, because that was simply what the Army did. Where the Army had learned to think this way, and precisely when, is where the actual origin of this story sits. The document survives today in the Francis M. Woolburn Papers, held in a library at San Diego State University, a 38-page paper-bound booklet carrying a War Department seal on its cover. Its full title is Basic Field Manual, Military Intelligence, Counterintelligence, serial designation FM30-25, dated February 15, 1940. In February 1940, the United States Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men, ranked, by most contemporary assessments, somewhere outside the world's top 15 military powers by raw size, smaller than the standing forces of several countries popular memory does not typically associate with major military strength. Hitler had been at war for less than 5 months. Pearl Harbor sat 21 months in the future, and the United States remained, officially and by considerable popular preference, neutral. In a modest office inside the War Department's G2 intelligence section, a small staff of officers was completing a manual on a subject almost nobody outside that office had any particular reason to care about yet: counterintelligence. A discipline that in 1940 carried nothing resembling the institutional prestige or public recognition the term would eventually accumulate over the following decades of Cold War intelligence culture. Reading the table of contents tells you what the authors considered worth addressing, and the ordering itself is instructive. Section 2 covered secrecy discipline. Section 5, the preparation and handling of documents. Section 7, the movement of troops and individuals. Section 9, censorship. Sections 2 and 7 matter most for this account. Section 2 states a principle that took most of the rest of the world's armies until well into the 1950s to formally adopt as doctrine. Secrecy was not a specialized function belonging to a dedicated intelligence service. It was, the manual stated plainly, the daily responsibility of every individual soldier. This was not how most armies of the period actually operated. In the Wehrmacht, in the Red Army, in the British Army through most of its own history, secrecy sat institutionally with officers and intelligence specialists. An ordinary soldier's responsibility began and ended with his own weapon and his own orders. The 1940 American Manual proposed something different: that secrecy functioned as a discipline exactly like weapons maintenance or personal hygiene, something every soldier participated in daily, whether he understood the larger operational logic behind it or not. Section 7 contained the specific paragraph that became the doctrinal seed for everything that followed, titled in characteristic Army deadpan, Precautions Prior to Departure. It instructed that before any unit moved out of an occupied area, that unit was to erase or conceal all evidence of its identity, its numerical strength, and its intended direction of movement. Foxholes filled, trash buried or burned, documents accounted for, equipment markings concealed. The prose itself was entirely unglamorous. The implication buried inside it was considerably larger because it treated the ordinary act of vacating a position, something every army in history had always done and had almost never thought to formalize as a security procedure, as itself a discrete tactical operation requiring specific, trained execution. Did many people actually read this manual in February 1940? Almost none. Distribution was limited, and there was as yet no mass training apparatus built specifically around it, because there was not yet a war to train for. But doctrine documents inside a peacetime army serve one durable function regardless of how few people initially encounter them. They eventually become curriculum. When the Army began its rapid post-war scale expansion after September 1940, from roughly 200,000 men to more than 1 million within a single year, and onward toward 8 million by 1945, the manuals drafted in that small Washington office became the base syllabus for training cadres being assembled across the entire country. By the time the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, every soldier passing through basic training was being told, somewhere in his opening weeks, that policing an area was not merely a punitive chore invented to occupy idle hands. It was, in substance, if not in the specific language used to teach it, a counterintelligence procedure directed against an enemy he had not yet personally met. The discipline extended further still. The Soldier's Handbook, FM 21-100, published December 11, 1940, devoted its 11th chapter to marches, camps, and bivouacs, and took as a settled baseline assumption that no American unit would ever depart a bivouac site without policing it thoroughly first. 25 years before Leave No Trace became a slogan of the American outdoor recreation movement, it already functioned as the working operating principle of an American infantry division at war. Veterans of the period frequently describe the resulting habit with a specific kind of affectionate, self-deprecating humor decades later. "The Army taught me to pick up after myself," one veteran's phrase that recurs in slightly different wording across a great many post-war oral history collections, rarely aware in the moment they say it that the specific discipline they are fondly recalling traces to a deliberate institutional decision made by anonymous staff officers in 1940, working on a war the country had not yet been permitted to join. A specific ritual recurs almost without exception across the memoirs of American infantrymen who served in the European theater, described so often that most veterans do not recognize they are, in effect, the central figures of this story. It happens before a unit moves out of an occupied position, sometimes because higher headquarters has ordered a general withdrawal, sometimes because the unit is simply rotating to reserve, sometimes because the line is being reorganized. The reason varies. The ritual itself does not. The sergeant gives the order, "Police the area." 2 words carrying an extraordinary amount of physical labor behind them, executed by exhausted men who had, in a great many documented cases, not slept properly in days, and who understood the order primarily as one more unwelcome task standing between them and rest. Foxholes filled with the same dirt that had been dug from them, packed firm underfoot. Slit trenches collapsed. Latrines covered under at least 2 feet of soil, the disturbed topsoil sometimes deliberately scuffed with a branch to erase the telltale edge a shovel leaves behind. Trash gathered. The waxed K-ration boxes an experienced German scout could reportedly identify at 50 paces, folded flat and burned or buried. C-ration cans punctured so they would not roll and reveal themselves, then buried alongside. Cigarettes were not simply dropped and stepped on. They were field stripped, the paper torn open, the tobacco scattered by hand across a wide area, the paper itself rolled between thumb and forefinger into a pellet smaller than a grain of rice, small enough that a single rainfall would finish erasing what remained. Letters presented the harder problem. A letter from a wife, a mother, a girlfriend is among the most information-dense objects any soldier carries. A return address, specific dates, and frequently, despite official censorship, oblique references to his unit and the men serving alongside him. A single intact letter recovered by a German scout and carried back to an IC officer could, in principle, compromise an entire battalion's security. The discipline accordingly specified that letters were never simply discarded. They were burned individually, the ashes scattered, or in the case of a hurried withdrawal under direct pressure, left with a unit's mail clerk for formal evacuation through proper channels, a specific procedural distinction that mattered enormously to the soldiers themselves, since a letter from home carried emotional weight the Army's own doctrine could not simply order away, and men who might have followed every other instruction without complaint sometimes resisted destroying a letter outright, preferring the mail clerk option whenever the tactical situation genuinely allowed it. Private John B. Cummings of Company A, 276th Infantry Regiment, 71st Infantry Division, learned this discipline personally along the Rhine River in Alsace in the final days of December 1944. The 71st had only recently arrived in the theater. landing at Marseille in mid-December and moving almost immediately into defensive positions to help blunt the German Operation Nordwind, launched in coordination with the larger Ardennes offensive further north. According to a memoir written by a fellow Company A veteran, Frank Lowry, the men of the company were told, as they took up their positions along the riverbank, to dispose of any letters they carried and to remove their unit shoulder patches. The stated reasoning was direct. If any man were captured, the enemy was not to learn which American unit had crossed into this specific sector. This was not a routine blanket instruction issued before every engagement. It was tactical, specific to this particular position, and clearly rehearsed procedure rather than improvisation. The kind of order a green, recently arrived division could nonetheless execute correctly precisely because the underlying discipline had already been drilled into every man long before he ever reached the riverbank. Cummings was killed on the night of December 31, 1944, alone in his foxhole, armed with a Browning automatic rifle, when a German raiding party crossed the river. His comrades heard machine gun fire in the darkness and worked their way back toward his position. They found only his helmet, struck through by a single bullet. His body would not be formally identified for 74 years, confirmed only in 2018 through mitochondrial and autosomal DNA analysis performed by the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency on remains that had been interred unidentified since shortly after the war, following their transfer to a processing center in France, under the designation Unknown X-6454. Part of what made identification so difficult, according to the Army's own later accounting, was precisely that Cummings and his comrades had carried out the procedure they had been ordered to carry out with full discipline. He carried no shoulder patch. He carried no letters. Whatever the German soldiers who found and buried him near the riverbank recovered from his body offered no indication whatsoever of which American unit he had belonged to. The same discipline, built specifically to deny the enemy useful information, had also, in a smaller and considerably more personal way, made it harder for his own family to eventually bring him home. A quiet, largely unremarked irony embedded directly inside the discipline's own success. Multiply this individual episode across an entire army, sustained continuously across 2 years of combat, and the cumulative effect is the near total disappearance of an entire category of battlefield evidence German reconnaissance doctrine had always assumed would simply be there for the taking. Field strip the cigarette, bury the can, burn the box, fill the hole, cover the latrine, remove the patch, pocket or burn the letter. 7 instructions. The entire counterintelligence campaign of the United States Army on the Western Front condensed to a working checklist. Was the discipline applied with perfect uniformity everywhere, every time? No. Some units maintained it more rigorously than others. Some sergeants enforced it more strictly. Formations withdrawing in genuine haste under direct pressure inevitably left more behind than doctrine specified. Surviving German intelligence reports occasionally register something close to open relief at discovering the rare American position that had been imperfectly policed. Reports German 1C officers apparently seized on with real enthusiasm, precisely because such reports were the documented exception rather than the general rule. Across most of the Western Front, the empty field was the norm. What makes the pattern genuinely striking is that the American soldiers executing it were, by every available account, unaware they were running a counterintelligence campaign at all. They believed, almost without exception, that they were simply keeping their kit and their area clean. The institutional reasoning behind the discipline, why exactly a filled foxhole mattered strategically, remained largely invisible to the men filling it in. That opacity functioned, in its own way, as a genuine operational strength, a procedure executed reliably by millions of men who do not fully understand its larger purpose, does not depend on any individual soldier's morale, education, or strategic insight to keep functioning. It only depends on the sergeant's order being followed. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers were attempting to read fields that had effectively been swept clean by an uncoordinated army of soldiers who had no idea they were, collectively, functioning as a distributed counterintelligence operation. The German intelligence services fielded during the Second World War were not, by any honest measure, incompetent. They were professionally staffed, technically capable, and had accumulated genuine operational sophistication across years of continuous combat on multiple fronts. The question worth asking directly, then, is why an organization of that caliber could not simply replicate what the Americans were doing once the pattern became visible in their own reports. 3 specific reasons emerge from the surviving record, and each illustrates something distinct about how the two military cultures had developed along genuinely different structural lines. The first reason is structural. Wehrmacht reconnaissance and counterintelligence doctrine placed the primary burden of operational secrecy at the level of staffs and headquarters, rather than at the level of the individual rifleman. Field soldiers executed tactical security tasks, camouflage discipline, controlled march noise, but the systematic, automatic, every soldier, everyday practice the Americans had built directly out of FM 30-25 simply had no equivalent inside the German training pipeline. This was not because German planners had never considered the idea in the abstract. It was because, for most of the war's duration on the Eastern Front, the operational pressure to invent such a system had never genuinely materialized. The Red Army, operating at extraordinary scale and often under severe time pressure of its own, tended to leave abundant traces behind it as a simple byproduct of how it fought. German scouts operating in the East could generally rely on finding something. When the Wehrmacht first encountered American forces in North Africa in 1942 and 1943, the difference registered mainly as a curiosity. Americans read as wealthier, less personally attached to individual possessions, generally more casual about what they discarded. German intelligence officers noted the pattern in writing. It did not occur to them that the entire pattern was the deliberate output of a formal, centrally issued doctrine. The specific institutional inertia behind this first reason deserves a moment's further attention, because it is easy to treat as a simple oversight rather than what it actually was: a rational allocation of limited training time against a threat model built almost entirely around Eastern Front conditions. German training resources by 1943 and 1944 were under severe and worsening strain, competing against manpower shortages, equipment scarcity, and the urgent operational demands of a two-front war. Redirecting scarce training time toward a counterintelligence discipline that had not yet demonstrated clear tactical payoff against an opponent still relatively new to the theater was not an obviously wise investment from the perspective of a training officer working inside 1943's actual constraints, even though, in retrospect, the payoff would have been considerable. A German training memorandum recovered after the war, dated to early 1944, and addressing reconnaissance instruction more generally, makes no specific reference to American field discipline at all, discussing enemy reconnaissance countermeasures almost entirely in terms appropriate to the Eastern Front, a detail that, more than any single interrogation quotation, illustrates how completely the doctrinal blind spot had persisted even after 2 years of direct combat contact with the actual pattern it failed to address. The second reason is documentary. By April 1943, German forces had begun removing identifying markings from vehicles operating on the Eastern Front, a directive issued by Army Group Center that historians studying the period generally treat as a direct precursor to the more comprehensive marking concealment measures introduced ahead of the Kursk offensive. But this was a narrow fix applied specifically at the level of vehicle identification, not a broader doctrine addressing what an individual soldier left behind at a bivouac. And the order itself was explicitly reactive, issued because German intelligence officers had grown concerned that steadily improving Soviet reconnaissance capability might exploit those markings to track German divisional movements, rather than emerging from any general doctrinal commitment to denying the enemy information as a standing operational principle. The German scout entering an empty American position in 1944 carried nothing in his own training comparable to precautions prior to departure as a standalone instructional topic taught at squad level from the very start of basic training. The third reason is cultural, and cultural explanations of this kind deserve to be handled with some caution since they are frequently overstated. Still, the testimony collected across post-war interrogations of German officers is remarkably consistent on one specific point. Wehrmacht units routinely left behind letters, photographs, identity documents on the dead, and, a detail Allied interrogators noted repeatedly, extensive personal diaries. Many German soldiers of this period kept detailed diaries as a matter of ordinary personal habit, a practice that gave Allied intelligence officers an unusually rich vein of material to work with when reconstructing German unit dispositions on the Western Front. And one German counterintelligence doctrine of the period made comparatively little formal effort to discourage. The diary-keeping habit itself traced to a specific German educational and cultural tradition that prized personal written reflection, one that predated the Nazi regime by generations, and that no wartime directive, however urgent, was likely to override quickly through simple institutional decree. Put these three factors together: doctrine that never systematically pushed secrecy discipline down to the individual soldier, vehicle marking concealment introduced reactively while bivouac-level markings remained largely untouched, and a documentary culture that continued producing exactly the kind of personal material an opposing intelligence service could exploit, and the practical consequence across a sustained 2-year asymmetry was severe. Beginning in November 1942, the British-led Western Front Intelligence Committee working out of Bletchley Park began systematically compiling order-of-battle assessments of German forces in Western Europe. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, that committee had successfully identified all 58 German divisions then stationed across France and the Low Countries. Germany's own intelligence apparatus, for all its genuine sophistication, achieved nothing remotely comparable against the Allied order of battle. American troop concentrations building up across southern England ahead of the invasion were systematically and substantially underestimated by German assessments. General Patton's entirely fictitious 1st United States Army Group, an elaborate deception built around dummy equipment, fabricated radio traffic, and a genuinely credible commander's name attached to a force that did not exist, was accepted by German intelligence as broadly real for weeks after the actual Normandy landings had already broken out of the bocage. A substantial portion of that gap traced directly to the accumulated silence of German ground reconnaissance, to 4C officers across the Western Front who had, by late 1944, largely stopped trusting reports their own scouts brought back, because those reports had grown too thin, the blank spaces on the map too large, the resulting estimates too speculative to build serious operational decisions on with any real confidence. The asymmetry, stated plainly, ran in one clear direction. By late 1944, Western Allied intelligence held a near-complete picture of the German order of battle across France and into Germany itself. German intelligence, operating in the identical theater against the identical category of adversary, was guessing. Not because the men sent forward to gather information were lazy or poorly trained, but because they were being asked to read ground that had been deliberately, systematically emptied of precisely the material their own doctrine had spent decades teaching them to interpret. a post-war historical program run by the U.S. Army's own history division in occupied Germany, interviewing several hundred former Wehrmacht officers across the years immediately following the surrender, recorded the identical bewilderment surfacing again and again in careful, professional military language. We could not see them. We did not know what we were looking at. The ground we walked over was simply bare. That bareness is the actual answer buried inside the original question. Frustration is the specific feeling produced by an obstacle standing directly in your way. This was something different because there was no obstacle in the conventional sense. Nothing actively concealing information, no camouflage to defeat, no deception to unravel. There was only an absence, complete and unadorned, and a professional tradecraft that had no interpretive category prepared for absence as a deliberate, engineered condition rather than simple bad luck. The Army term for the specific ritual behind all of this rarely appears in the formal published histories with the weight it probably deserves: the police call. Any Army veteran of the period recognizes the phrase instantly, usually with a faint, self-deprecating smile. A platoon spreads out across a given area in a long line, shoulder to shoulder, and walks forward slowly, picking up everything that does not belong to the natural ground beneath it. Cigarette butts, bottle caps, scraps of paper, stray twigs, anything foreign to the terrain, moving at roughly the pace of a careful child searching a beach for shells. When the ground reads clean, the exercise ends. Some units ran the exercise a second time from the opposite direction, specifically to catch whatever the first pass had missed, a small refinement that individual sergeants appear to have introduced on their own initiative, rather than through any formal instruction, suggesting the discipline had, by 1944, been absorbed thoroughly enough into unit culture that soldiers themselves were quietly improving on the original doctrine without anyone above them directing the improvement. The police call carries no glamour whatsoever. It appears in essentially no war film. There is no dramatic cinematic sequence built around a line of infantrymen policing a muddy field. It sits well below the threshold of popular memory. And it remains, for exactly that reason, one of the more quietly consequential rituals in the operational history of the American military. Because for 4 sustained years, the police call functioned as the United States Army's primary tactical counterintelligence operation, executed daily by every infantryman, every clerk, every artillery crewman, every signal operator, every cook, in every theater the Army fought in, without a single one of them being told in so many words that this was the actual purpose of the exercise. They understood it, almost universally, as picking up trash. The deeper answer to why German scouts kept returning from empty American positions with a specific sense of bafflement rather than ordinary combat frustration runs through this exact structural gap. German military reconnaissance, as a professional tradition, had developed across centuries on the working assumption that soldiers leave things behind, because across recorded military history, they reliably always had. The Roman scout, the Mongol rider, the Napoleonic dragoon, every reconnaissance tradition on record rested on that same unexamined premise. Break that premise deliberately at institutional scale, and the result is not merely a more difficult intelligence environment. It is an intelligence environment the existing tradecraft has no vocabulary to describe at all. Within German doctrine's own internal logic, a patrol that returned with nothing had failed its assigned task. The system located the failure in the scout rather than in the specifically engineered void he had actually been sent to search. By December 1944, when the Ardennes offensive opened, German intelligence estimates of American strength in that specific sector were wrong by a genuinely significant margin. German commanders believed they faced a thin, brittle screen of American units, held largely by exhausted formations resting after earlier fighting and by inexperienced divisions new to combat. Within 72 hours of the offensive's opening, they were instead confronting the better part of 9 American divisions, with reinforcements arriving continuously. The resulting intelligence failure had multiple contributing causes: flawed assumptions about American command structure, degraded German signals interception once Allied forces shifted substantially toward buried landline communication in the West, specifically to defeat radio intercept, and over-reliance on a dwindling handful of agents still operating behind Allied lines. One of those contributing causes, Quieter than the rest and rarely credited in the standard operational histories was the police call, repeated daily for 4 years by roughly 12 million American service members, the overwhelming majority of whom never understood they were executing a coordinated intelligence denial operation at all. The verdict this account arrives at is not the one its opening scene might initially suggest. It is not that American soldiers were somehow smarter or more naturally disciplined than their German counterparts. German reconnaissance officers were genuinely skilled professionals, operating a tradecraft refined across generations of hard-won institutional experience. The verdict, stated plainly, is that the United States had made an institutional decision early enough for that decision to mature fully before American forces ever entered sustained combat, that secrecy was the standing responsibility of every individual soldier, enacted through small, unglamorous, endlessly repeated physical motions rather than through any single dramatic act of deception. This is a different explanation from the familiar claim that the Allies won simply because they were wealthier, or because they eventually outproduced their opponents in raw material terms. Both of those explanations are also substantially true, but the war was decided across a great many small, largely invisible theaters running in parallel to the famous ones, and one of those theaters was a single, empty foxhole in the Hürtgen Forest on a cold morning, where a German reconnaissance patrol stood in the gray light and found precisely nothing to report. A specific detail from a divisional intelligence log recovered after the war captures the underlying dynamic with unusual precision. A German 1C officer, reviewing a patrol report from a sector adjacent to the Hürtgen fighting, wrote a single marginal note beside the blank entry for identified enemy material. Nothing found. Confirmed scouts entered correct position. A request his own superior officer apparently never had occasion to answer because the scouts had, in fact, entered exactly the right position and had simply found nothing there to identify. The men who actually wrote FM 30-25 in that Washington office in February 1940 do not appear in any popular film about the war. Their names survive, if at all, buried in the masthead of what reads today as an entirely unremarkable government document, filed alongside hundreds of other peacetime field manuals that never received any comparable retrospective attention. Nobody involved in drafting it could have known, in February 1940, that the specific paragraph on precautions prior to departure would eventually shape how badly a German general staff misjudged American reserve strength ahead of the largest single German offensive on the Western Front. But for 4 continuous years, the doctrine they drafted was carried out, in small physical increments, by millions of young men who had no idea whose specific institutional work they were actually completing every time a sergeant told them to police the area. This asymmetry left a specific, measurable trace in the German Army's own post-war self-assessment. Officers who had served as IC staff on the Western Front, interviewed at length in the years immediately following the surrender, returned repeatedly to the specific difficulty of explaining the pattern to interviewers who had not personally experienced it, several describing an almost superstitious quality to how thoroughly the Americans had erased their own presence from the ground, language that sits oddly alongside these same officers' otherwise clear-eyed, technically precise accounts of Allied firepower, logistics, and air superiority, all of which they discussed in the same interviews with considerably less apparent difficulty. War of this scale is frequently remembered as a contest of great engines, great commanders, and decisive individual battles, and at times, quite genuinely, it was exactly that. But it was also, in a considerably less cinematic register, a contest fought with shovels, field-strip cigarettes, and burned letters, conducted by ordinary soldiers who understood themselves to be doing nothing more significant than tidying up before they marched on to the next position. The silence they left behind them, a silence complete enough that a professional, well-trained enemy could not read it at all, was, in its own quiet and largely unrecorded way, a genuine form of victory. It produced no citations, decorated no uniforms, and appears in essentially none of the standard operational histories of the campaigns it quietly shaped. It simply worked, for 4 years, exactly as a small group of anonymous officers in a Washington office had written it to work, long before anyone reading their draft could have known there would be a war to test it against at all.